Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. This webinar is a briefing on the latest research from the Poverty and Inequality Partnership, Inequality in Australia 2024, who is affected and how. I'm Penny Dorsch, the ACOSS Project Manager for the Poverty and Inequality Partnership. I'm subbing in today for Carla Trelaw, who unfortunately could not attend. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're joining from, in my case, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to their elders past and present. The Poverty and Inequality Partnership is a unique partnership between the Australian Council of Social Service and UNSW Sydney. This partnership seeks to combine the strong research of UNSW with the advocacy and policy work of ACOSS to produce research that is both impactful and accessible. We would like to thank the NGO supporters of the partnership, 54 Reasons, part of the Australia Save the Children Australia group, ORACI, CoHealth, Food Bank Australia, Jesuit Social Services, Life Without Barriers, Mission Australia, SSI, and the Smith family. And John Mitchell. We are fortunate to be joined today by the lead writer of this report, Dr. Peter Davidson. Peter is a recognised expert in social security, employment and tax policy. He is currently employed at ACOSS as Senior Advisor and also runs his own consultancy in his spare time. He has been writing these core reports for ACOSS for the Poverty and Inequality Partnership, Poverty in Australia and Inequality in Australia, since its inception. Also joining us is the lead researcher for the report, Dr. Bruce Bradbury. Bruce works at the Social Policy Research Centre at UNSW Sydney. His extensive research delves into poverty and inequality, the assessment of living standards, income support, labour market policies, and the geographical aspects of social policies. Finally, I'd like to welcome our lived experience expert, Angela Finch. Angela has been a part of the Poverty and Inequality Partnership steering group for the past couple of years, sharing her expertise as someone directly impacted by poverty and inequality. Angela is a sole parent to 3 children aged 15, 11 and 6. She was plunged into poverty in 2020, escaping domestic violence, and has been working tirelessly to build a financially secure future for her family. Angela had to give up her social work degree due to inadequate support payments and the cost of living crisis. Before we commence, I'd like to flag a bit of housekeeping. Please use the chat function to interact with other attendees today and to flag any technical issues you might be experiencing. Please use the Q&A functions to pose your questions, and we'll get to those a little later in the webinar. Today's webinar will be recorded. I will now invite Peter Davidson to present the findings of the report on income and wealth inequality, including earnings inequality, followed by Bruce Bradbury, who will introduce his online income and wealth calculators. Angela will then respond from a lived experience perspective, and then we'll move on to a facilitated Q&A session. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Penny. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. I'm joining you from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and welcome any First Nations people participating in this webinar. And I'm also joining you from my car under the flight path in Sydney, so I do apologise in advance if there are any sound issues. So I'd like to take you through quickly some of the key findings of this report, starting with income inequality and then moving on to wealth inequality. Next slide, please, Penny. So going straight to inequality of income, we've used data from the ABS income survey from 2019. Unfortunately, they haven't published one since then, but in that year, the highest 10% of households ranked by income had $5,248 a week in income after tax, and remember these are households, not individuals, which was 2.5 times the after-tax income of the middle 20%, with just under $2,000 a week, and 7 times that of the lowest 20%, with just under $800 a week. So moving to the next slide, this graph shows the percentage of household income from different sources for each of 5 equal-sized household income groups, from the lowest 20% on the left to the highest 20% on the right. Now, of course, income inequality is caused by the different forms of income people receive, whether it's wages, investment income, social security, and so on. And those incomes are offset to a degree by income tax. So just stepping you through the sources of income for each of these groups. This graph shows the share of total household income for each group that comes from private income, which is a combination of wages, self-employment income, the light blue bars, and investment income, the dark blue bars. And what you can see here is that the lowest 20% on the left receive only half their income from private sources. The other half is social security, essentially. And the share of income that is wages or self-employment income gradually increases as we move up the income scale and a greater number of people in the household are employed, and they're employed on higher wages. And then for the highest 20%, a relatively large proportion of their income comes from investments because they can afford to make them. Next slide, Penny. So this slide shows the impact of government on income inequality. So we have the same 5 income groups from left to right, and it shows the proportion of their total income that comes from social security payments in red, and the deductions in income tax in blue. And what you can see clearly is that the proportion of income coming from social security declines pretty quickly as we move from low to middle income households, and the level of average tax paid increases as we move up the income scale to the highest 20%. Thanks, Penny. Now we're shifting focus here to inequality of individual earnings. As you can guess from a previous graph, around 70% of all household income is wages. So the distribution of wages has a big impact on income inequality. And one interesting finding of this research is that individual earnings inequality, that is inequality of wages for full and part-time workers, decreased in the last 2 years as unemployment went down. And just to provide the context, this graph shows long-term trends in average wages across the community, consumer price index, which is the fainter dotted line underneath the dark blue line, which is average wages, and average hours per worker, which is the red line down the bottom. And what you can see is that in the period on the left, which we call the period of stagnation, earnings growth wasn't very strong. In fact, it wasn't any higher than inflation. Real wages after inflation didn't really increase at all from 2012 to 2019, just before the pandemic. Then in the pandemic, there was a sharp increase in wages due to the JobKeeper payment. And then we had the recovery period after the lockdowns from 2021 to 23, and you'll see earnings are moving relatively quickly, but then so is inflation. And so on the whole, from 2012 to 2023, wages haven't moved much further than inflation. In other words, real incomes on average for wage earners haven't increased at all for a decade, which is pretty extraordinary. And if you look at the red line, there was also in that last 2-year period a step up in hours of paid work. And that's part-time workers who managed to find additional hours at a time of lower unemployment. So Penny, next slide. So now we turn to that last 2 years, from 2021 to 2023, the recovery period after lockdowns. Unemployment fell below 4%, where it hadn't been for decades, and employers found it hard to secure labour. And this had an impact, obviously, on unemployment, which impacted income inequality, reducing it, but it also had an impact on inequality of earnings amongst those receiving wages. So what this graph shows is the average annual increase in wages for both full and part-time workers between 2021 and 2023. And if you look at the blue columns, you'll see that on the left-hand side, D10, which I should have labelled that better, it's the lowest decile or 10% of individual wage earners. Their wages went up by an average of 4.9% a year over that period. Whereas D90 on the right, the top 10%, their wages on average went up by 3.3%, a whole lot less. So wages of low paid workers went up around 1.5 times the increase for high paid workers. And given that over many decades, earnings inequality has been increasing, and that made a big contribution to the overall increase in income inequality we've seen, that this is quite extraordinary. Penny, next slide, please. And it's also a finding of researchers overseas, particularly in the US, that a large part of the growth in earnings inequality over decades was unwound in the few years after COVID. So, what are the reasons for this? This graph compares growth in job vacancies, the red lines, and reductions in unemployment, the blue lines, over the last few years for workers at different skill levels. And what you can see there is that unemployment fell a lot more and vacancies rose by a lot more for the low skilled group, who were the folk who were often in part-time or casual jobs. And all of a sudden, in that period of so-called labour shortages after the lockdowns, employers had to compete for those workers, whereas for decades before that, those workers had to compete for entry-level jobs. And so that, together with fairly substantial increases in minimum wages, is, I believe, the reason for that extraordinary reduction in earnings inequality. Next slide, please, Penny. Am I going for time? You're muted, Penny. Never mind, I'll just rush through. Next slide after that. Okay, turning to wealth inequality. Wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality. So if you compare the average wealth of the highest 10% of households ranked by wealth, not ranked by income, who had on average 5.2 million in wealth, to that of the lowest 60%, which is actually the majority of people, who had an average of 343,000. It's 15 times. Top 10% has 15 times the wealth of the lowest 60%, and almost 100 times the wealth of the lowest 20%. So wealth inequality is much greater than income inequality. Next slide, Penny. So what forms of wealth are causing this wealth inequality? This slide shows the shares of different sources of wealth, for example, owner-occupied housing, other real estate, which is investment property, super, and so on, that go to those three wealth groups, the highest 10%, next 30%, and lowest 60%. And what you can see is that shares and investment property, other real estate, are very heavily concentrated in the hands of the highest 10%. Over 60% by value is held by the highest 10%. Owner-occupied housing and super is less concentrated in the hands of high wealth households, but still pretty heavily concentrated in their hands. Next slide, Penny. So another key finding of the report is that over time, wealth has become more concentrated in the hands of both high wealth and older households. So we look at wealth by age as well as wealth by wealth group. And this slide shows that the share of wealth held by the highest 10%, which is the pale blue line up the top, grew over the last 20 years from 42% of all wealth to 44%, whereas the lowest 20% by wealth, their share of overall wealth fell from 20% to 17%. Next slide, Penny. Now this one shows changes in the share of all wealth by age. And it started raining here, so I hope that's not interfering with the sound. So over the same period, the share of wealth held by older people, households 65 and over, rose from 27% to 34%, and that's the pale blue line in the middle, while that of middle-aged households declined, and that of young households, the blue line down the bottom, remained very low, 7 to 8% of overall wealth. Now, we would expect that older households would be wealthier than younger households because they've had more time to accumulate wealth, and the proportion of older households has risen from 22% to 25% over that period. But the growing debate around how wealth is distributed between generations suggests there's something more going on, that older generations have gained at the expense of younger people who've been locked out of home ownership, for example. Our research suggests a more nuanced view, that a minority of wealthy people in that top 10% by wealth have done very well indeed, claiming a growing share of overall wealth. And while most young households have had very little wealth over the period, a minority of young people, the top 10% of young people, have enjoyed very strong growth in wealth, well beyond that of the rest of their cohort. In other words, we need to view wealth distribution from two dimensions, age and by wealth level. Next slide, Penny. And I'm getting near the end, so I hope I'm not out of time. So a two-dimensional view of wealth inequality is needed to unravel this issue. And two-dimensional views are more complicated, so please bear with me. Now, I'd like you to ignore the top half of this graph for the moment and just focus on the bottom half, the share of all wealth. And what we have here is a breakdown of all household wealth in 2022 and what proportion of it goes to each wealth group, the lowest 60%, upper middle 30%, and highest 10%. And then to each age group, divided up into the three wealth groups. So under 35, 35 to 64 years, and 65 years, disaggregated or divided up between the three wealth groups, so two dimensions. So if you look at the lower half of the graph, share of all wealth, the top row, which says all, it repeats what I said earlier, that the highest 10% overall had 44% of all wealth. And just concentrate on the dark bars, which is the highest 10%, because that's the key story here. And then within that 44%, 18% of overall wealth was held by wealthy older people, 25% by wealthy middle-aged people, and only a few percent by wealthy younger people. And if you now look at the top half of the graph, which shows the share of all households in those various groups, what you'll see is that the top 10% overall has 44% of wealth. The 4% of all households who are wealthy older households have 18% of all wealth. And it's the wealth of that group that has grown the most. And indeed, their wealth is greater than the combined wealth of all other old people in the lowest 60% and upper middle 30%. So in part it's an age story, but it's also a social class story here, of wealthy older people who've probably had higher incomes throughout their working lives and are now doing very well. So next slide, Eddie. So another interesting finding of the research is what proportion of these different wealth and age groups pay any income tax. And I'd like you to focus on the right-hand side of the graph, which shows the percentage of different households who pay any income tax at all. And so overall, the two right-hand columns, 71% of all households pay some income tax, and 81% of the highest 10% by wealth pay some income tax. As you'd expect, they're paying more because they've got a lot of more income from investments. But then when you look towards the left at the breakdown by different age groups, younger households and middle-aged households, well, they're generally paying over 80% of them are paying at least some income tax, but older people much less so. So only 28% of older households are paying any income tax, in part because their incomes are low, if you think maximum rate age pensioners, for example. But then look at the 65 plus highest 10% group, that the wealthy older group, whose average wealth is $5.5 million, more than half of it in investments as distinct from their own home, and only 62% of them are paying any income tax. Almost 40% are paying none. And so there's something wrong with our tax system in terms of the taxation of returns to wealth. And of course, if you don't tax returns to wealth, then more of it accumulates, and more of it accumulates in the hands of the wealthiest. Next slide, Penny. And I should say the report goes into some detail as to the tax treatment of the different forms of investment that older, wealthier group and others hold. And it's largely a superannuation story, together with the tax treatment of capital gains and negative gearing. That group have accumulated wealth more rapidly than they otherwise would have because of the tax shelters available to them. Now this graph shows, this is looking at trends over time, and the share of the increase in overall wealth over the last 2 decades for all households that's gone to different groups. So if you look at the bar on the right-hand side, and again, this is divided up into the lowest 60%, middle 30%, and highest 10%. 45% of the overall increase in household wealth over the last 20 years accrued to that highest 10% group of all ages, almost half. And then if you turn to the left-hand column, we break it up by age. So it's the same data, just divided up by age. And of that 45% of the overall increase in wealth going to the highest 10%, roughly half went to wealthy older people and roughly half went to wealthy middle-aged people. And what that means is that wealthy older people received a disproportionate share, because there, of course, are many more middle-aged households than older households. Older households are only 25% of the total. Next slide, Penny. And here we have another perspective on cumulative changes in wealth over the last 20 years. Slightly different perspective. It's the percentage increase in average wealth for different groups. So our same age groups broken down by bottom 60%, highest 10%, and so on. And what I'd like you to focus on is the left-hand columns, the under 35 group, young people. And bear in mind, these are younger households, not young people living with parents. So the reference person or highest income earner is under 35. So these are share households. These are younger people who've moved out of the parental home, and they may or may not be partnered. Not many of them at that age are homeowners or purchasers, unfortunately. So if you look at that breakdown, the striking thing is that young households in the highest 10% of those young households by wealth saw extraordinary growth in their average wealth levels over the last 20 years by 126%. Overall household wealth over the period grew by 74%. This group 126%. And a large part of the wealth that's currently held by that group is in investment property and shares, as distinct from owner-occupied housing when you break it down. So this is a group of younger people who've had access to money to accumulate substantial investment assets. And when we broke it down further by income, the source of that money really couldn't be their average incomes. It was the bank of mum and dad, essentially. And so we've seen this extraordinary growth over the period in inequality within young households, which doesn't augur well for wealth inequality in future. If if wealth inequality is growing very strongly amongst younger people. And of course, the lowest 60% of young people there, whose average wealth grew by only 39% over 20 years, they're not purchasing their homes. They've been locked out, along with many of the upper middle there. So young households have only 7% of overall household wealth, but within that group, wealth inequality has grown extraordinarily quickly. And final graph, Penny. Oh, we missed it.
Apparently there is no final graph. We missed it. Do you want to just
sorry.
tell us about it verbally?
Well, that one shows the share of wealth within it's the same story, the share of wealth within younger households, and how it changed. And so over the period from 2003 to 2022, the share of wealth within younger households under 35 in the lowest 60% fell from 17% to 12%. The share of the highest 10% of younger households ranked by wealth rose from 38% to 49%. So extraordinary growth in their share of overall youth wealth, if you like. Bear in mind, these aren't the same households over time. These are changes in the distribution of wealth amongst people who are under 35 at different points in time from 2003 to 2022. But it paints a worrying picture. And I'll leave it at that, Penny. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was fantastic. I'll now invite Bruce Bradbury to tell us about his wealth and income calculators.
Okay, thanks very much, Penny. You might as well stick the slides back up. So I'm also coming to you from Gadigal land in the west of Sydney, and I'd like to start by paying my respects to elders past and present from this land. So at the end here, I'll briefly run through these calculators that we've been developing as part of this project. These are interactive web calculators that people can use to explore the income distribution. There's two, one on income, which has been up for a while, and a new one we've now created looking at wealth inequality. So the idea of these calculators is you can put in your own income or wealth and see where you lie in the distribution, or you can just look at the information that we portray on the patterns of the income distribution for different income and wealth distribution for different age groups. And you can access these via the Poverty and Inequality website. So just seeing time's moving on, I'll just briefly run through two examples that I did earlier rather than actually get the interactive website up. So Penny, if you can move on to the next slide. So this first example is the example of a young household with median wealth. And so on the left-hand side there, under the My Household section, I've put their age, and I've assumed they've got about 20,000 in super. In this case, I've assumed they are homeowners, and the home value minus the amount they owe the bank, so their net wealth is 150,000 in this case, and they've got $10,000 worth of other wealth. And so a household of this type, age where the reference person's age 15 to 34, is pretty much in the middle of the wealth distribution for people of that age group. And that's what's shown over on the right-hand side where that little me arrow and the red bar is pointing. So on the right-hand side there, we've got one bar for each percentage group of the wealth distribution. So each bar represents 1% of the population. This is a more fine-grained presentation than we do in the reports, where we only go down to the top 5%. So it does mean these numbers are more imprecise, But we've done this in order to give you a better picture of how disparate the wealth distribution is in Australia. And if you look closely, you can see we've put error bars on there indicating the precision of the different estimates. So in particular, the top 1% is quite imprecisely estimated. But anyway, so for this household, they're in the middle of the distribution. They've got a total household wealth of 180,000. But to emphasise the point that Peter was making a minute ago, at the very top end, we have some households headed by young people which have an extremely large wealth balance. So on this graph, around 6 million or so in total wealth for that household. And so, yeah, so the wealth distribution for people aged 15 to 30, for households headed by people under 35 is quite unequal, very unequal. And then the next comparison, if we move on to the next slide, I've gone to the other end of the age distribution and looked at the situation of what we might call a super millionaire, someone with $1 million in superannuation and about to retire. And so here I'm just looking at their personal wealth levels rather than household wealth levels, just to keep it simple. So in the top left box, I've put them being aged between 60 and 69, and I've said they've got a superannuation balance of 1 million. We've pulled out superannuation separately because that's a form of wealth that people are interested in accumulating for retirement. But of course, people get regular statements, and so they have a good idea of what their balance is. And then down the bottom, I say I want to look at personal superannuation balances and compared to people of the same age. So someone with $1 million in superannuation in their 60s is definitely right up the top of the wealth distribution. Their superannuation is greater than 93% of all people in that age group, and greater than 92% of men, and even more, greater than 95% of women. But of course, there are people with much higher superannuation balances. So the top 1% in that age group has a super balance of over $4 million. And even the second percentage down, their superannuation balance is over $2,000. Sorry, $2 million. So there's perhaps, when you start entering these numbers for yourself, there's a real temptation to look at the people to the right of you on the graph and think, who are these people richer than me? But we also need to look at the people to the left. And as you see, there's a very long, low tail here of people who have extremely small superannuation balances in their 60s. And the pop-up box, which has appeared down the bottom there, is the situation of someone in the middle of the distribution. So the middle person in their 60s only has around $90,000 in superannuation entitlement. And then, of course, you've got the other half of the population who have less than that. And as you can see, there's a long tail who have essentially close enough to no superannuation balance. So that concludes our presentation. If you just move on to the next slide, I'll just finish with a little plug for our course that we're running. We're running a course on these issues, a short course. The current version, which starts in a couple of weeks, is sold out, but we're running it again in October. So information on the website. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I have just figured out how to stop sharing my screen. Yay me. Thank you. That was excellent. I would like to now invite Angela Finch, our person with lived experience, to respond to the presentation with some of her experiences and some suggestions for change. Angela.
Thank you. So I'm in that bottom part. I'm in the lowest 20% of wealth holders, and I'm got $6,400 in my super. I pulled out when I could to escape violence and pay for all the things that you need to do during then. And I am so much more interested in the left side of Bruce's graph than I am the other side, in the sense of the way I look at it is we have two decisions. Or two choices. We can be open and honest and say this is how we're structuring our economy and are structuring our communities and our workplaces and our society as a whole, and go, okay, well, that's the way we're going to leave it, and we're not going to change any of the structural things that we could, but we're going to support the people on the lower side of the graph correctly so they can have a life with dignity. Or the better solution is to pull structures down. And I know it sounds really radical, but we were doing a bit of a tech rehearsal yesterday for this, and we had a discussion about where are these people? Where are the highest? Where are the people in the room? How do they feel about owning all this wealth and locking other people out through nothing other than structures and systems that have allowed them to accumulate so much wealth, while at the same time blaming our poorest people for the social issues that we have as a country. So it's a lot of pressure to put all the responses and solutions on me. So I'm going to throw it back, in the sense of I think we need to become better advocates, all of us in the room, all the NGOs of part of the poverty and inequality group. We need to step up our game. There is no point doing research and pulling apart the systems unless if we're only doing that for ourselves to get into a room like this and wave our finger and go, it's really bad, and what are we going to do? There is no point. I don't see any point in that anymore. We've had 20 years, we've just looked at 20 years of data here, and the wealthier are getting wealthier, and I don't think it's any new information to a lot of people here, that's been happening, and there's a trajectory for it to keep happening. So I think part of the solution is we need to become better advocates. We need to become activists in a more tangible way of changing policy, or admitting or having the conversation with our most wealthy in this country going, okay, you can keep your wealth and we're not changing anything, but we're going to spend more money over here on supporting people correctly. I am one of those people that are going to work for the rest of my life. There is no super, there is no house in my future. I can barely see a uni degree for my children, let alone anything else. When I gave up, just in the short span of the 4 years when I left the DV situation, we had those extra payments as people on low incomes. We could plan for our future, and we could have dignity in our lives. No one in the system that I've ever met wants to stay in the system. No one is there going, yep, this is what I dreamed up. I dreamed up of living off a couple of $100 a week and not being able to afford a house. Or I grew up thinking, I know, I'll go and buy a tent one day and park it outside my local police station because I've got nowhere to live. Not because I'm a bad person, not because I didn't pay my rent, because it's no longer, a house is no longer affordable anywhere in this country. So I'm going to open it up to more questions, because I don't think I can give you all the solutions everyone wants to hear. I've got heaps, but I don't think we're in the right room to talk about it, in the sense of we need to get into our parliamentary ears. We need to get into those wealthier ears and put the question back to them. Are you happy for this? Do you really think you've worked the hardest you can, the hardest than our lowest paid in this country? Do you really think you're working harder than they are and you deserve all the wealth you have? Did you really create it by yourself? And I think one of the interesting things out of all the graphs is that 35 in that lower age bracket and 126% of wealth. Like, are those young people, have they been working their cattle ground since they were a kid and just kept really having great investments, or have they had the social advantage of the family around them, the community around them? my biggest solution to everyone in the room is we need to be better advocates and advocates. And there are so many, I think, like the food bank do great work, but wouldn't it be excellent if we didn't need the food bank anymore? Wouldn't it be excellent if we didn't need Life Without Barriers and Mission Australia, because we're looking after everyone correctly and in a way with dignity? I was listening to something the other day, and I think what we've forgotten about the lowest earnings and wealth people who have it is they deserve a nice life. Everyone deserves a nice life. And what does that mean? That means to be able to have 3 meals and a safe place to call home and access to education and access to health. And one thing I want to put in there is next year, let's do an inequality in health section to this, because I think both the inequality in income and wealth has a direct relation to health. I'll pass it back to you, Penny, and you can shoot me the questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Angela. You've made some really good points there, and I totally agree with you. We just need to be better advocates, and also more focused. I'm going over to the Q&A, but there doesn't seem to be any questions in there. So I'm firstly going to encourage everyone to post your questions in the Q&A.
So I think there's some in the chat.
There's some in the chat.
And one of them concerns the calculator not working. I'm afraid it is because we've overloaded it. So please come back after this session and have a look at it.
Try tomorrow, maybe.
It is actually working, but just slowly at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that, Bruce. There is a question that Olivia has put in the chat. She's asking how we get these younger but well-earning professionals, those who are upwardly mobile, to care more about others. I think Angela.
Yeah,
I think this is one for you.
I think it's totally. I think we need to tell more stories, and I think this goes for both groups, the younger group and the older group. I don't think we live in a country where that top 10% are thinking they're bad people, or thinking that the people down the lower end of the scale are bad people. Don't deserve a nice life, or don't deserve a home. But I think there is a disparity in how the broader community and our broader society actually views people like this, and it's the storytelling, and it does put a lot of burden onto the people that are living that experience. But myself, I didn't get here because of a bad decision or because I was a bad person. I got here because I was treated poorly in a relationship, and then at a moment in time, and it was purely a moment in time, where we stopped bickering about who deserves a home and who deserves to eat and who deserves an education, and just made sure everyone had those things. So it gave me time to get out of there, and to refocus and to rethink about my life and reshape it, and think about things like, how do I create a future for my children and myself where I can pull away from this system that helped me and become fully independent out of that system. But the system has drawn me in closer and closer and closer to the lower end of the scale, and I'm working more and more. So I think it's about storytelling. I think it's about getting, we've had this horrible time in media where we had the dole budger and the leaners, and I don't know, as a single mum, you get it a lot. And there's a blame factor there. That let's blame the person instead of what happened. How awful for you. Let's hear about your story. Let's hear about the little barriers that most don't understand, that are in play. And just, one example of it is if those people in casual and part-time work, how much they lose off their Centrelink benefits when they're earning, you know, it's 51 cents in a dollar that you lose. And that's just on JobKeeper. It's more if child support and stuff's involved. So I don't think people, you know, and yeah, I think it's about storytelling and getting it out there that no one deserved this, and no one actually, it's not their fault. If we, you know, we can deep dive into why kids are disassociating with school, it comes back to social issues. It comes back to all of this that we're talking about. And there needs to be more stories of, and I saw one in the media this week, you know, the top 2 private schools got double government funding when they didn't. What? Like, how can they get more funding than the local public schools? There are those conversations. We have to bring it down into the micro, into the little everyday stuff, because the people that are living in the lowest part of our graphs, it is every day. It is every little thing part of their lives. And I think that's what's missing, that it's not just not being able to pay bills when you're living on that lower end of the scale. It is in every little decision. What item I buy in the supermarket? Do I go to the doctor, or do I wait a couple more weeks or months until there's something else wrong and I can get my bang for buck? If you can get a doctor at all, that is. Yeah, I think it's the conversations we have, and stop demonizing people that are at the lower end of the scale, and maybe put that mirror on the top end. Let's put that mirror right in their faces. And I think that's where our work needs to come in, and we need to become better advocates. We need to get in those rooms and ask those wealthier people, what are you doing? Are you okay with this? Because if you're okay with it, great. I've got some people that want to pop up a tent on your extra large backyard.
That's a great point. Thank you, Angela. I'll move on to one of the data questions here for Peter or Bruce. It says, based on your data, this is from Esther, based on your data, what kind of systems change is needed in terms of fiscal poverty to prevent intergenerational inequities deepening, such as Bank of Mum and Dad? Thomas Piketty really has a point.
You want to start, Peter?
Happy to. Yes, I think Thomas Piketty does have a point. I think we could make much better use of the tax system to begin with. I mean, at the higher end, the best tool to prevent excessive wealth accumulation and super high incomes is the progressive income tax system. At the lower end of the distribution, of course, the best tool available is the income support system and lifting job seeker and other payments, which is long overdue. But in terms of tax, we have in theory a progressive income tax system, but in practice, many people on the highest incomes, especially people with investment income as distinct from wages, have effective tax rates below that of the average worker because of lower tax rates on capital gains, profits from selling property, the negative gearing arrangements, the tax treatment of superannuation, and so on. The system is riddled with loopholes that are the product of well-heeled lobbyists who are encamped in Parliament House. I spent part of this morning in a Senate hearing on a proposed change to the tax treatment of super, so that superannuation accounts of $3 million and above would attract a higher rate of tax, 15% more. Now, currently, once you're retired and the fund is paying you a benefit, the investment income of the fund, the interest, the capital gains, and so on, is completely untaxed, which is absurd and obscene, in fact. And so this would impose a tax, very low tax of 15% on that investment income. And the lobbyists were all there, arrayed at the table, arguing that this would have a terrible, terrible impact on farmers, on small businessmen, on people who are just having a go. These are folk with over $3 million in superannuation and a great deal of assets outside of super, no doubt. And so I just made the point that those folk live in a very different world to the people on $55 a day on job seeker payment, and budgets are about priorities. And so, yeah, I think we've got to be in there and across the detail and arguing consistently and repeatedly that this can't go on. We need to close these loopholes and shelters in the system. And it's a hard fight because those who oppose us are very well resourced and very influential. But we just have to persist with it.
I think that's code for they've got more money than us, Peter. Right?
Yeah, that's right. and smart advisors. You know, some of the best so-called best brains in the country have turned their minds to how can people with $1 million or more in assets avoid their income tax? You know, shift those assets into super, won't be taxed at all. It's that kind of nonsense that we're dealing with here.
I just quickly say I totally agree. And just to summarise, that it's basically the wealthy older generation are the people who are not paying enough tax now. And there's many strategies that could be used to remedy that. But as Peter says, there's going to be lots of opposition.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. I just wanted to draw attention to a comment that Olivia's made in the chat and see, Angela, if you've got a response to this. She feels that the media banging on about the cost of living crisis is starting to make things worse, in the sense that now everyone thinks they're doing it tough and are therefore perhaps losing their empathy for others. If you could just answer really quickly, Angela.
I read Olivia's comment and gave it a thumbs up. I totally agree with you. And this is where the nuance of the work that we all do needs to come in, and we actually need to push back harder and harder. And I think that it has made it worse. It really has. That cost of living, and well, everyone's experiencing it. Yeah, we're all experiencing the same cost increases in our goods, but not all of us have the ways to move our budget around to actually accommodate those. So again, the people on the lowest end of the scale are going out with more and more, and we could go on for ages about it, because another great comment just below Olivia's, which I think leads into this too, is how do we protect stuff like Medicare when it's already eroded so badly? Like where I live, you cannot get a bulk billing GP. I've been told to travel on the bus for 4 hours because I don't have a car, can't afford one. So to take me and my family to around a 4-hour round trip, which means taking a day off work essentially to get a doctor, they are being eroded, and we need to push back on who we get to tell these stories and stop. We need to dismantle the judgment we put on people, and that's where it comes from. If we're not, and I've been doing this for a few years now, and I show up in these rooms and I'm wearing nice clothes and a bit of makeup and a pair of earrings, and I'm like, well, you don't look poor, you don't look like you're living there, because if I look like I'm living there, you're not going to listen to me. So this is where I'm like, it can't be one thing or the other. And again, I don't think it's about looking at wealth and income payments all separately. This is all interlinked. They're all related to each other. Our education system, our health system, they are all interlinked together, and we need to stop going, well, we can only do one thing at a time. No, we're really clever and we can do multiple things at once, and we kind of need to. We actually really need to do more than one thing at once. Otherwise, we're just creating a bit more disadvantage over here. Let's fix this and put that under the carpet because that's too hard right now. We'll save that for next budget. No, we'll do it all now because we can, because we're brilliant, and it's a choice we're making. And maybe that's what we need to get across more in these rooms. We are making a choice as Australia, as individual states and communities, that this is what we're choosing to do. We're choosing to give people over here money, but not here, because the perception is these guys have worked really hard for it and these guys just don't deserve it because they haven't done anything ever.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone who's attended. I can see that there's a bunch of questions that we didn't have time for. I'd really like to keep this going, but unfortunately we are we are over time already. So thank you very much. We have recorded this and we'll make that recording available and send you out the link to the recording and so on. If you've got any questions, please don't hesitate to